I'm also here in my capacity as Vice Chair of the Scientific Advisory Council of the Observatory on History Teaching in Europe. I was very happy today to hear the observatory mentioned several times because I think its work is extremely important today. Although I'm repeating something that many speakers have said already, I will still say this because I believe it is especially important, and it's especially important to the observatory's work as well. History education is essential to building, but not only building, but maintaining democracy. And I'm emphasizing maintaining because this, I think, is especially important in times like these, when the question is no longer developing democracy as it was for post-socialist states when I was growing up in 1990s Romania, but rather preventing its backsliding. And for post-socialist countries, the recent history of the communist regimes is particularly important for a number of reasons. One, because it is recent, and for most students, it's still personal. Even if students in primary and secondary education today, unlike myself, have not lived through communism, but their parents, grandparents, or relative would have. And this is a lived experience that I'm sure is omnipresent in conversations at home. Second, because it is of public interest. We heard a lot about this already. The history of totalitarian regimes in Eastern Europe are a subject of debate in the media and public debates more generally in commemorations and so on. And third, it's important to teach the history of the communist regimes because it was often in counter-distinction to the former communist dictatorships that the new democratic identities, if I may call them so, of post-socialist states were developed after 1989, or after 1991 in some cases. Along these lines, opening up the archives of the former secret police or political police, whatever you want to call it, is extremely important. Without such access, one of the most infamous branches of the repressive state apparatus of communist regimes would remain a black box. And the black box is always subject to suspicion, to speculation. It arises feelings of fear alongside curiosity. And opening these archives is instead indicative, as Professor Dennis Teleton said this morning as well, of a commitment to transparency in public life. The prime example of that is that of the GDR, of the East German Republic in 1990, when people stormed the Stasi offices, as we heard this morning. And already in 1990, access to the former Stasi archives was open to the public. And this calls into question the very existence of these archives, the reason why it existed and why they were so, why the surveillance was so extensive and intrusive in people's private lives, was that socialist states did not trust their citizens. They were afraid of their citizens because they suspected, and often with good reason, that the citizens themselves did not trust and were afraid of their own states, which again was true. And this is, of course, also a legacy through which young democracies need to work through in order to build or rebuild this trust between the state and its citizens. As a Romanian citizen who lives in Ireland now, one of the things that strikes me when I travel to Western Europe is that citizens tend to trust their state, whereas where I come from, to this day, people are mostly suspicious and do not trust their state. And I think that opening up these archives, showing this dark legacy of the communist period, is extremely important in building this relationship of trust between the citizens and the state. But also going back to what really concerns us, how to use this in the classroom. This opening of archives connects to our emphasis as historians on the use of primary sources as one of the building blocks of the discipline. And this is absolutely key to a quality history education. The general report on the state of history teaching in Europe that the Observatory recently released makes that very clear. And this is, I believe, all the more so a priority in an age when our students do not suffer from a lack of resources. As someone who grew up under communism, I know very well how hard it was to find reliable information about the country's history. Today, students suffer from the opposite. They suffer from information overload. And the more controversial a topic is, the more likely it is that there is a problematic historical content available, especially online, what in recent years have come to be known as alternative facts or fake news. And the problem with such content is that it's often very nicely packaged. It makes use of the latest technologies, uses social media for dissemination, etc. So the job of the history teacher is perhaps more difficult than ever, and it becomes even more difficult when it comes to dealing with the very recent past. Now, there are two words that are important in the title of this panel: opportunities and challenges. And I think there are great opportunities in using material from secret police archives in history teaching. One, because there is fascination of the students with the secret in secret police archives. I know this from my own personal experience in 15 years of teaching. Such stories of repression, of intrusion into people's personal lives, but also of spies, as many students understand them, in many ways definitory for the period of the Cold War. This is attractive to students. Using such archival sources is potentially attractive to students. They have a feeling of accessing what was previously forbidden knowledge, of tasting the forbidden fruit, which is ultimately what I think knowledge is all about. The second reason why there are this is an opportunity is because showing documents, and again, I find this in my classroom experience, showing archival sources as they actually were is always interesting for students. It's more interesting, more engaging than reading a historian's description of those sources. And in this particular case, it also helps dispel this aura of mystery and suspicion which surrounded such repressive institutions as the secret police. A third reason is that, as I was saying already earlier, this is directly relevant to their life worlds. And I found time and time again that students relate to history when that history relates to them, rather than being some impersonal story about events that happened, something that happened that somehow involved them. And like I said, they would have heard stories about this communist period in their families over Christmas dinner, since we are close to the holidays now. And this relates to that. It relates to their life words. It's relevant. And as Mr. Villano Kiriazi said this morning, archival documents have the power to transform abstract historical events into real human stories. And there are real human stories in secret police archives. I know because I've worked with such files. And these real human stories can help us connect to students better. And finally, another opportunity is that we heard a lot today about how relevant these documents are for understanding the workings of the state and of the repressive apparatus of the state, which is, of course, very important. We out of both historical curiosity and out of respect and responsibility towards the victims, we need to look into the repression practiced by the communist regimes. But they're important for much more than that. They're also important for social history, for the history of everyday life. Unfortunately, this extensive surveillance was an extremely important part of everyday life under socialism. So there is material in these archives about much more than just repression. One of the things I'll give you as an example. There were extensive files in the archives about people who grew homing pigeons, these pigeons that you can send somewhere to deliver a letter or something and come back, because these pigeons crossed borders, and anything that crossed borders in Romania was suspicious in socialist Romania. So there is extensive material about pigeon growers. There are extensive files on jokes about the regime, which tell you something about the mindset of the people in the 1980s. So there's more in there than just a story of repression. Of course, there are also challenges. And the main challenge is an issue of privacy, especially concerning people named in archival documents, whether as victims or as perpetrators or as collaborators. We've heard a lot about lustration, so I'm not going to go into that. But especially when it comes to the names and the memory of victims, some of them may want to be named and some of them might not. So there's an issue in terms of the ethical dimension of using such material in the classroom. Another challenge is the fact that this is a political issue, which is likely to be polarizing in class. But I teach things that are complicated and complex, and I think we shouldn't shy away from such topics because they are difficult. We should engage with them precisely because they are difficult, and even if they're an emotional subject. Another challenge is the question of how to translate or integrate such archival sources into teaching materials and the type of sources that we should be focusing on. But I think here, the work that has been done by previous national institutions, from Germany to Czech Republic or Slovakia to Romania or Poland, in terms of these institutions that are in charge of these archival holdings and their educational activities, there is a lot to learn. And there's a Slovak colleague in attendance, and I know of a project in Slovakia, which was doing something that I also do in my courses, i.e. It sends secondary school students in their neighborhoods to try to find victims of the communist regime, such as former prisoners of conscience and so on, and prepare a story of their lives, which could be in the form of an essay but also alternative media. In Poland, there's a very popular initiative of the Institute of National Remembrance, the Commission for the Prosecution of Crimes Against the Polish Nation, has been the development of board games. One of them has come to be internationally popular. It's called Kolejka, or Q, and it deals with the hardships of daily life in the last years of communist Poland. It basically makes you play the difficult ways in which people obtained basic goods in communist Poland and, of course, in the communist Eastern Bloc. And it was released initially in Poland, and following its success, it had versions with international versions with translations in English, German, Spanish, Japanese, French. The Romanian version was released in 2013. The Federal Commissioner for the Records of the State Security Service of the former German Democratic Republic, long name, I know, but this commission that deals with the secret police archives in Germany organizes events, exhibitions, but also has created materials using excerpts from archival documents, which are accompanied by worksheets, by handouts for teachers, educational DVDs and audio files. So they've already made this into teaching material that can go into a history lesson. And they also provide, all of these institutions, from Poland to Germany to Romania or the Czech Republic, they provide teacher trainings where they teach history teachers how to overcome the challenges associated with the use of such archival resources and make the best out of the opportunities available. And I think Albania has taken a major step forward in terms of providing access to these archives. And I'm sure that in cooperation between, the Ministry of Education, the authorities in charge of the archives, and the teachers themselves, because I think it's very important to involve the teachers themselves, because they know the students best and they know what will work and will not work in a history classroom. I'm sure there are plenty of opportunities to develop interesting educational materials using these archival resources. Thank you.